Hi, and thank you for tuning in. I'm sure that you're having a very busy conference in person in Bergamo, so thanks a lot for tuning in and watching this video as well. My name is Patryk Dobkiewicz, and I'm a PhD student at the Faculty of English at the Mickiewicz University in Poznan, Poland. I'm also a trained Polish English interpreter, and interpreting is the motivation and the context for my current research project. So the topic of my presentation today is the conference interpreter as agent in multilingual political discourse, extending experimental approaches to CDS. And the research I will be presenting today is part of a larger project on the production and reception of interpreted political discourse. So I'm going to talk about the results of one finished study and how they have informed an ongoing second study. And a quick note on terminology before we start. Anytime I will be referring to interpreting, what I mean is simultaneous interpreting in a conference setting. So done by interpreters sitting in booths, headphones on, microphone, interpreting in real time from one language into another. So the main general question that I'm concerned with in my project is, how does interpreting influence the ideological salience of political speeches in multilingual settings? So why ask such a question? Well, because there is growing evidence that interpreters have a co-constructive role as agents in political discourses. A number of studies have focused on how the interpreter as an intermediary between a speaker and a listener may alter the shape of political debates, whether they do it deliberately or not. And probably the largest context in which this has been studied, because of the availability of data and the large volume of available data, has been in the European Parliament, where all plenary debates are interpreted simultaneously into all member state languages. So one of the early studies, Beaton studied English and German contributions in the European Parliament. She analyzed how interpreters extend source text metaphor strings, which she interpreted as strengthening EU institutional discursive hegemony. In a later paper, she studied the debates on the Guantanamo Bay camp, and she described interpreters' online negotiation of ideological terms, which points to a hybrid positioning of interpreters, being between the ideologies of different speakers in the European Parliament and having your own worldview as well. In a later large study of impoliteness in the European Parliament, Bartłomiejczyk identified a broad variety of different linguistic means through which interpreters may weaken the ideological load of source texts in the European Parliament, through omission, addition, removal of metaphors, and other phenomena as well. In fact, Bartłomiejczyk followed that study with two case studies on Polish members of the European Parliament, Polish interpreters in the European Parliament also, and she largely focused on similar linguistic phenomena, such as omissions, generalizing, hedging, in a study on racism and Euroscepticism in the European Parliament. And it does appear that interpreters often hesitate to fully communicate the intensity of the ideological load of the source texts which they are interpreting. They seem to have this tendency to mitigate this ideological load. But Bartłomiejczyk, as in these studies and the studies from the previous slide as well, the researchers here only work with the available transcripts, so they have no actual insight into the interpreter's ideological positioning. And it is in such cases basically impossible to distinguish between deliberate ideological work of interpreters and the typical coping tactics which can be observed when interpreters do interpreting, because as a cognitively demanding task, interpreting will always have its fair share of omissions, of generalizing, just because interpreters have to cope with this intense cognitive load of doing the actual task of interpreting. So outside of the European Parliament, the Chinese government interpreters have been analyzed in quite some detail recently. And this appears to be quite a special case, because Chinese government interpreters actually are members of China's ruling party. They are employees of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and a number of different studies investigating different aspects of Chinese government interpreting all point to a certain ideological alignment of the interpreter with the speaker, in a way extending the government's ideological narrative in the target text in a different language, which is quite different from the European Parliament, where mitigation or weakening of ideology appears to be more common. In fact, some studies like Gu and Tipton's from 2020 show an intensification, not just a precise communication of this ideological load of the source text, but an intensification of Chinese nationalism, for example. Gao's 2021 study showed how interpreters may overtly mitigate anti-Chinese and intensify pro-Chinese statements by foreign speakers, again showing that the interpreter may extend and intensify a national narrative, let's call it. So all of these studies from the European Parliament, from the Chinese context, show that interpreters across a variety of different contexts, different languages, have the capacity to co-construct political discourses. And they are in fact quite likely to alter the ideological load of source texts in a meaningful way. So if interpreters can mitigate political discourses, can in a way shape them, could interpreting be another potential factor in the ongoing process of normalizing radical discourses, as described by Krzyżanowski, among many others? Well, to answer all these questions, to explore these ideas, let's first take a quick look at my own now finished study, which builds on previous studies of European Parliament discourse. And here I was interested in two primary research questions. Do interpreters reproduce the meaning of ideologically salient source text tokens neutrally, or do they mitigate or intensify them in the target text? And is there any systematic correlation between ideological shift and the ideological orientation of source text speakers? So to answer these questions, I had a look at authentic speeches from the European Parliament. I analyzed 49 source texts in English and the corresponding 49 interpretations into Polish. These interpretations were delivered then and there, actually during the plenary debates. I transcribed the speeches from videos available in the European Parliament Multimedia Archive. They all come from the 2014-2019 European Parliament term for thematic relevance. And quite importantly, the dataset includes contributions from all political groups active in the European Parliament during that term, which allows us for a comparison of linguistic phenomena between different ideological positions. Now, this is mainly a qualitative study, so the analyzed dataset is limited by the labor-intensive methodology. So we're looking at about 19,500 words, just under 2.5 hours of speech. So my methodology for this study is based on tools of the discourse historical approach within CDS, with its focus on discursive strategies of self and art representation and the linguistic realizations of that. So here I'm focusing specifically on the discursive strategies of nomination and predication. So I focused on noun phrases and verb phrases, which refer to and characterize the key social actors and phenomena in the analyzed speeches. And my aim was to identify possible ideological shifts between source text and target text. And what I mean by that is whether the ideological salience of the phrases was maintained, mitigated, or intensified. So I looked at 1,054 tokens from the dataset and the corresponding 1,054 target text tokens in Polish, interpreted from English. So specifically, I looked at the different linguistic phenomena which may emerge between the two texts. So for example, when ideological salience of a phrase, a token, is mitigated, is weakened, this could emerge from a generalization or addition of hedging, while intensification may result from specification or omission of hedging, which was present in the source text before interpreting. A broad variety of different linguistic phenomena, largely based on Bartłomiejczyk's 2016 study, also includes metaphor, work, omissions, additions, different phenomena like these. So let's take a look at some examples. Here we have a neutral rendition in the target text. We are looking at the predication of member states of the European Union. A speaker in the European Parliament said in English something like, "Some of those countries are deeply and institutionally corrupt and untrustworthy," which was interpreted into Polish as, "Some of those countries are deeply institutionally corrupt and untrustworthy." So we see that this is a very close translation, and the rhetorical force, the ideological salience of the modifiers of the whole phrase is very much maintained in the target text. But it may be mitigated as well, as in this case, where a member of the European Parliament referred to the European Union as your already failed project. Meanwhile, in the target text, the interpreter produced the phrase European Union. So the intensely negative figurative language from the source text was replaced by the formal name of the European Union in the target text. The ideological salience was weakened. In fact, we could say it was removed. But ideological salience may also be intensified, strengthened in the target text, as in this case, where a speaker referring to migration used the phrase "a free-for-all." But in the target text, the interpreter uses the word "madness." So by changing the metaphorical target domain from sports to mental illness, the interpreter strengthens the anti-migration sentiment of the speaker. So if we count up all of these tokens from the analyzed dataset, all the 1,054 source text tokens, we can see that a majority of all source text tokens underwent an ideological shift, with mitigation being more common than intensification, a result that pretty much follows previous research from the European Parliament of mitigation being the more common type of ideological shift. A chi-square test of independence showed a significant association between the type of token, so nomination or predication, and target text realization. So when we look at the nomination tokens, positive correlation is observed with the neutral realization, and this is different for predications, where positive correlation is observed with mitigation strategies. Nominations are interpreted more neutrally than predications, which tend to be mitigated. Now, if we look at the relationship between ideological orientation of the source text and interpreting realizations, we can see that there may be a tendency for far right and far left tokens to be interpreted less neutrally than the result for all tokens in the corpus. But in fact, this relationship is not statistically significant. So the samples, as we can see here, for the specific political positions are quite small. So this is a limitation in this study, the size of the analyzed corpus. So some conclusions from this study. It gives further evidence that mitigation and intensification in interpreting may result from a broad variety of linguistic phenomena. And it also shows that these phenomena may be observed all across the political spectrum, regardless of the ideological orientation of the source text. Now, nomination strategies are generally realized more neutrally than predication strategies. So they tend to be really, when we look at, when we read closely the examples, they tend to be more predictable for interpreters working in the European Parliament, dealing with the same sort of speeches, the same sort of language, more predictable than predication strategies, which tend to be more creative, less repetitive. So while qualitative analysis indicates a possible trend for far left and far right language as being more susceptible to ideological shifts than centrist language, for example, the results are actually not statistically significant here. So the issue requires further study, possibly on a larger corpus of data. Now, whether any of these ideological shifts are the result of deliberate ideological work by interpreters is impossible to say on the basis of text data like this, because the demanding nature of interpreting as a profession means that interpreters regularly have to resort to different coping tactics in order to maintain communication between the parties participating in the debate. And one of the most common such tactics is omission of elements which could be considered non-essential, like modifiers. And this appears to be responsible for many of the observed ideological shifts. So how do we follow a study like this? Well, we could follow it by a study like what I'm doing currently. This is an ongoing study, so while I cannot share the results just yet, I can share some methodological considerations. And I attempt to build on the results of the previous study by attempting to control some of the random variables that naturally are present when you analyze authentic discourse, as well as by collecting data about interpreters' own ideological orientation. So I'm looking specifically at two research questions here. Are ideological shifts more likely to be observed when the source text is more highly ideologically salient? And is the occurrence of target text ideological shifts correlated with interpreters' own ideological orientation? So to answer these questions, I have first prepared experimental stimuli on the basis of the results of the CDS study. So these are semi-authentic source texts, which are to be interpreted by professional interpreters, and they have been controlled for ideological orientation and for interpreting difficulty. And the way I have prepared these is I started with 2 rounds of norming surveys. So I actually extracted 547 unique English tokens from the dataset in the previous study, and this was rated by 3 informed researchers, which could be seen as a specialist audience point of view on a left, center, right scale. And in those cases where the raters agreed on the ideological alignment of the phrases, those 236 tokens were selected for the second round of surveys, were 90 students of the Faculty of English at Dobkiewicz University in Poznań, which could be seen as a general audience point of view. So we have 2 different points of view here when creating stimuli, rated those phrases on a 7-point Likert scale. The 90 most unambiguous phrases were selected for inclusion in the actual source text to be interpreted, 30 each for a left-wing, a centrist, and a right-wing speech. So the result of this process was the composition of 3 different speeches written around the phrases selected in the survey. Those were recorded, 3 versions of recordings for each speech, so that they can be counterbalanced later when presenting these to interpreters. They have been controlled for difficulty, for speech length, and the other most important thing in this study, other than the stimuli, is the ideological orientation questionnaire. So most studies of ideological orientation of participants, be it in linguistics or in political studies, really tend to rely on single question self-identification. So basically, are you left-wing? Are you right-wing? And this is despite the reliability of such questions being questioned since at least the 1980s, because the complexity, the fluidity of ideological labels makes identifying yourself nearly impossible for a non-specialist audience. So instead, I'm measuring interpreters' ideological orientation using the EUNI2019 questionnaire, which is a valid, reliable tool for measuring ideological orientation. So participants answer 22 questions about the current social issues, such as EU integration or migration policy, and this places them on a two-dimensional ideological spectrum. So by using questionnaires such as this, we can reliably measure interpreters' ideological orientation and later investigate whether it influences their interpretation of political speeches. So in the actual study, if we take the stimuli, we take the questionnaire, we take the previous DHA methodology, we arrive at this ongoing study where I'm recruiting professional interpreters to interpret recordings of speeches controlled for ideological orientation. I am analyzing the products of their interpreting the target texts while focusing on the renditions of noun and verb phrases selected in surveys. So again, have they been mitigated, intensified, or interpreted neutrally? The analysis is very similar, but I have this additional data, which is the ideological orientation of interpreters as measured with the questionnaire. So a study like this, as far as I know, has not been attempted when analyzing ideological shift in interpreting, and something that could potentially reveal a factor in the presence or absence of ideological shifts. So for example, do left-wing interpreters intensify the ideological load of left-wing speech, or do they mitigate it to avoid seeming biased, or do they mitigate right-wing speeches because they disagree with these views? This is something that I hope to be able to answer during this stage, and something that really could not be answered on the basis of corpus text data only. So a quick summary, quick conclusions when it comes to the methodology, really. These critical discourse studies methodologies, I believe, could really be beneficial also when it comes to more experimental approaches. They can be beneficial in indicating some tendencies for investigation in more controlled settings, for creating stimuli for studies in controlled settings, and for providing initial results to be later triangulated with the results of studies in controlled settings. Right, thank you very much. If you'd like to take a look at my references, you may scan this QR code with your phone's camera. And thank you for watching this video. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, feel free to contact me at this email address. I would like to thank my PhD supervisors, Professors Fabisiak and Chmiel, and my thanks also go to the Polish National Science Center, whose research grant has made this project possible. Thank you.